So I am here with my friend Judah Pollack, who is the co-author of this new book, The Net and the Butterfly, along with Olivia Fox Cabana. And Judah, I'm so excited to be talking with you because are an old friend of mine. We first met in 2003 when I was working on the Howard Dean campaign and was his spokesperson in New Hampshire. And you were a bright, young, up-and-coming reporter for the Hippo in
The
Manchester,
hippo.
New Hampshire.
Wow, that is so true. That it just takes me back. It's crazy.
And
Back when
all,
journalism was dying.
and rather than dead right now. And now you are writing amazing business books. So actually, let me just start out with an initial sort of career arc question, because a lot of my listeners, viewers, etc., are people who maybe came to me through reading Reinventing You. They have professionally reinvented themselves, and so I'm actually just curious. Can you give us a little primer on how it was that you got from being an alternative news weekly reporter to the different steps along the way to writing this book and working for the special forces?
That's a question I sometimes ask myself as well on planes when I'm heading places, and I kind of have to ask myself, why are they letting me in the door? Um, Basically, it all comes down to my interest in people and how we all operate in the world. And so even when I had met you and was doing the reporting on the New Hampshire primary, the presidential primary, my interviews with the candidates are all about who they were, how they operated in the world, why they wanted to be president. I really wasn't interested in their policies or their canned speeches. So I always made sure to ask them a question that they could not be prepared for, like, when's the first time your heart was broken? And I started to understand that no matter what I had done in my life, I was always interested in the people. And then when I got to an age when I realized I should probably start to earn some money, that might be a good idea at this point. I looked around and discovered, luckily through a friend of mine, that there's something called organizational development, which I, of course, had no idea existed because I was a liberal arts student. And I was just like, it's all literature and whatnot. And so I started studying organizational psychology, industrial psychology, personality assessments, things like that, and discovered I was a very quick study because I had been studying it on my own. I just had no idea that's what I was doing, the patterns of people. And so I had the misfortune / good fortune to start working for companies without having a typical background. So I didn't have an MBA, didn't come from a typical consulting firm, didn't have an org psych PhD or anything like that. And so I was hard to get my foot in the door. But once I did, people were like, hey, this was really cool. Where did you learn this? Where did you find this? And I was like, yeah, I just made it up. This is all I know how to do. What is it that you're doing? And that's the first time I ever saw like a real professional slide, like a slide deck. I'd never seen one before. And so I started to get a reputation for doing things differently than other people did. And then I started to discover that if you could back up what you were saying with neuroscience, you could open even bigger doors. So I started doing a deep dive in the neuroscience and started to meet some of the neuroscientists themselves. I'm a big believer in going to the source. And in doing that, I ended up meeting Marcus Rakel, who is a neuro guy out of Washington University in St. Louis. And he's the one who discovered this thing called the default mode network. And that's the network, not by itself, but that's the network that actually is the mechanism by which we innovate. It's the mechanism by which we see new patterns. We connect things that were never connected. It's literally the mechanism in our brain that allows us to have breakthroughs.
That's fantastic. I want to talk about that because that's the subject of the book, but I just want to first hit on something that you alluded to quickly, just because I think this is the interesting part. This is the part that gets glossed over a lot. You said it was hard to break in at first, but then once you got a toehold in various organizations, you began to sort of make a name for yourself because people realized you were doing things differently. I am curious, maybe you can give just one or two examples. What did you do to get those early toeholds? What was that process like? How did you convince those first people to let a random liberal arts major tell them about how to run their organization?
Well, it definitely went in steps. To start with telling them how to run their organizations, it started with doing straight up team stuff. So it was a smaller ask. So whether it was doing personality assessments, and a lot of people use Myers-Briggs. It's not really my favorite, but the Jungian theory underneath is really fascinating. Using things like Enneagram is fascinating. Almost every personality assessment is based off of the same 4 principles, and they just sort of explain them in different ways. And some people make animals out of them. Some people make colors out of them. Take your pick. But coming in it was a less risk to ask of these people. It was also through people that I knew. So there was already a trust built up in some way from a social relationship. And then a request to be like, hey, I'm starting out. I was really honest and really vulnerable. I'm starting. I have this skill, let me show you what I do here in your living room. And once some of these people had a sense like, oh, okay, you're not a complete idiot who's going to get me in trouble for bringing you in, they were willing to say like, well, let me talk to somebody I know. This is stuff that we do anyway. And then I was allowed in from there. And then I met somebody else and did the same thing, and they let me in. So you're initially able to say, like, hey, I've worked for SAP. And so that gives the next person a little more comfort in bringing you in. And then I had the good fortune of meeting my first co-author, who was like, hey, I'm doing this work with the Army. Do you want to come? Which I was like, whatever. I did not. It was like, you're doing work for the Army. But it was. And so then I got to do, once I did something for them, I got to do a lot more and got to build up that muscle. And then once you start talking about having worked for the U.S. Army, it opens up again. So it's like it's like you're building these little steps bit by bit. And with each step, the trust you're able to garner from someone you don't know grows. And so it's just this gradual process. But the funny thing is that in building the steps, you actually practice your craft. And so as you practice your craft, you get better and better. So you're actually asking someone to take less and less of a risk the more and more that you do it, while at the same time, the more and more that you do it, the more and more people you're meeting. So it's this wonderful positive feedback loop that happens, but it requires a lot of patience and humility, because in the beginning, you're hoping, you're waiting, they're coming through slowly. And also it's like, you're not getting paid a ton. And sometimes you're coming in, it's like there are 4 people in the room, and you just got to be okay with that and recognize that all of it is in service to you getting better at what you're doing, and not worrying about the feedback you're getting, not worry about the gratitude you're getting, not worry about the applause. You're just like, I'm just trying to learn this and figure out how to make it valuable in the world for people.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Judah. Thank you. So, I mean, just to highlight a couple of principles, you said that essentially you mitigated risk for the early clients in a couple of ways. One was you were working on relatively smaller slices of projects, so it was not a huge ask for them. And second, you were coming in through people in the organizations that already trusted you.
Yes.
So those I think are important. And then you use social proof, the fact that you had worked for SAP or the fact that you worked for the Army to have that built up level of trust for subsequent contacts and subsequent companies that you are working for, which, for folks who are part of my recognized expert course, they'll know that there's 3 key parts of being a recognized expert, and social proof is one of them, along with content creation and your network. So taking the time to build your social proof early on is a really important lever. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and along those lines, I love the way you create like these models that make so much sense, because in my head they're sort of metaphorical images. But that idea of the content creation, every time going in to work with another team, having to build a new deck, having to figure out a new way to put it forth to people, and that was part of what brought me back, was the feedback that whoever brought me in, the feedback they would get would be like, that was really cool, that was really different. I really enjoyed that. It wasn't what I've always seen a million times. And so the freshness of the content, as well as the content getting better and better from the practice, had a huge part in allowing the return client, the repeat client to happen.
Yeah, fantastic. So Judah, let's dive into the actual content of your new book, the Net and the Butterfly. So basically, this is a book about. It's the subtitle is The Art and Practice of Breakthrough Thinking. It's about how to have more creative breakthroughs. And so early on in the book, you outline 4 types of creative breakthroughs. Maybe if you don't mind, could you walk us through that? Like what do breakthroughs look like? And how do you actually know that you've had one?
Hey, it's a great question. You kind of know you've had one, usually most people, because there's a physical sensation. We've all had that moment in the shower, right? Where you're just like, aha, and there's just a surety and a clarity to whatever has been daunting you or troubling you. And so it's listening. So even though a breakthrough is a mental experience, there's actually a physical bodily experience that goes along with a true breakthrough, where you just like know and you get excited. I mean, the famous story of Eureka from Archimedes, he went running through the town, literally naked, running through the town, screaming Eureka, because there's this physical exuberance from suddenly knowing something. And that's the first type of breakthrough we talk about, is the Eureka breakthrough, where it's sudden, it's immediate, and not only that, it's really concrete. You know exactly what it is you have to do. You know exactly what the answer is. So in Archimedes' case, he's like, oh, all I have to do is take the crown and submerge it in water and measure the displaced water. He knew exactly what he had to do to solve the problem of, was the crown pure gold or not? So Eureka breakthroughs are just bang. Then there's metaphorical breakthroughs. And those are the types of things that very often you hear about scientists having dreams. And they have a dream and they can't make sense of it. It's a weird dream. Singer, who invented the sewing machine, had a dream about these cannonballs and spears, but the spears had holes in the front of the tips. And he thought that was so strange, but that turned into the breakthrough of putting a hole in the front part of the needle, which enabled the sewing machine to do the lock stitch, and off he ran. So metaphorical breakthroughs force us to interpret them. There's actually a part of the brain on the right side, the ASTG, I won't get into what it's called, but it actually fires when we have a breakthrough. And neuroscientists can actually tell when you figured something out a couple of seconds before you know, because they can see that part of the brain light up. And that part of the brain is also involved in the interpretation of metaphors. So the interpreting of a metaphor and the understanding of a metaphor is actually intricately tied to having a breakthrough. So the metaphorical, another type, a third type is called intuitive. And this is when you just know, and you're not really sure why you know, but you're positive of it. It's going to take more time to work your way through it. And a great example of this is Einstein. And he just suddenly, he knew relativity was right. And he then went home and he spent 6 weeks writing out the math. He had to figure it out for 6 weeks. But in that moment, he just had this intuition. He's like, it's this. It's absolutely this. And the fourth one we call, which is very similar to Einstein's, we call it a paradigm breakthrough. And we cover it because they exist, but we're very, very clear that nobody should actually try to have a paradigm breakthrough. These are once in a generation breakthroughs. They shift the whole paradigm. They shift the way we see the world. You can't try to have one. It's not, it's timing, it's luck, it's tenacity, but they just kind of happen now and then. So they exist, they're wonderful, they help the world shift, but don't sort of put your head to it, because literally they're like once in a generation.
That's great. That's a terrific overview. Thank you. So speaking of things that we can do, that we can control, one of the things that I thought was most interesting in your book was you talked about rituals that you can do before sleep to make your sleep more productive in terms of coming up with breakthrough ideas. Would you mind walking us through that? Because this is something that I do not at all right now. So I have a feeling I can just 10x my life if I get started. So what should we be doing, Judah?
Okay, I want to put in a brief caveat, which is nothing that we have in the book will guarantee that you have a breakthrough. I just want to be really clear.
Fair enough.
We can help set the conditions to make it far more likely that you will induce breakthroughs far more often. But there's no 1, 2, 3 breakthrough. Believe me, I would bottle that. I wouldn't even bother writing a book. But it's an emergent process, and every neuroscientist you talk to says the same thing. So I just want to be clear about that. But sleep is actually an amazing way to access this part of our brain, to access this associative element that helps us open stuff up. And artists have known about this for a long time. Salvador Dali, in a book of his, actually talks about sitting in a chair with holding an iron key in your hand, hanging it over the arm of the chair with a metal plate on the floor, so that right as you fall asleep and let go of the key, it will hit the metal plate and wake you up. And the idea is that you're in this state called the hypnagogic state, which is right as you're falling asleep. And it's a twilight place where this part of your brain, the default mode network, turns on. And so what he would do is he would wake up and he'd start drawing whatever was in his mind at that moment to try and capture it, kind of the way you try and capture a dream right after you wake up. But you can actually enhance the process by focusing your mind right as you're falling asleep. And it doesn't necessarily mean focusing your mind on the problem the whole time. Here's the funny part about it. Because our breakthroughs are associative, it's very often more helpful to prepare ourselves by looking at other things. So memories can be really powerful in helping us create breakthroughs. So maybe go through like your high school yearbook before going to sleep. Maybe take a look at your last vacation or baby pictures or an old video that you remember, or talk to an old friend. So the prompting of memories can bring those to the fore, so that when you then fall asleep thinking about your problem, the memories act as catalysts to the process, which is really what we're talking about, is catalysts. Another great one is just taking a walk, and especially taking a walk somewhere you don't usually walk. And this does two things. One, walking is wonderful because it oxygenates the brain. So you're getting a lot of oxygen up there, a lot of fuel and energy. But the other thing that it does is if you're walking around things you haven't seen before, you're taking in new, just new. And those new things also act as really powerful catalysts, as different possible connectors to whatever the problem is you're working on. So as you're doing these new things, or just, you can watch a movie you would never watch in a million years, right? Like if you're always watching action movies, go watch a documentary on dolphins, right? Or if you're always watching documentary on dolphins, go watch the latest action movie. Like really switch it up, bring something really new into your space. And then as you're falling asleep, focus on the problem, right? And I don't mean like get crazy so you can't sleep. That's not what we're talking about. But just sort of put it into your mind, a kind of a mindfulness practice of like, right, this is the issue I'm having right now that I really like a breakthrough in. And so what you've done is you've sort of filled your mind with all this catalytic information. You've then focused your mind on what you want it to be looking at in terms of the problem. And then when you go to sleep, you're entering a state where those things can engage with each other in this special network in your brain, so that when you wake up, there's a good chance something will have popped, something will have happened. And this was a process that Adam Shire, who's the inventor of Siri for Apple, he used it constantly while creating Siri. Every night he'd be going to sleep like this and then waking up to work on things. So
yeah, that's so interesting, Judah. So, a related question that I have for you. Clearly, if you are working on something that's like a technical breakthrough, you're trying to invent a new thing that's really complicated, you can see where this would be helpful, because you need to focus in and, we need it to produce 75 liters, but it's only producing 50 liters. How do I get it to do it? One of the things that occurred to me as I was reading this is, obviously the concept of having breakthrough ideas is great. Like, I would love to have them every day about all kinds of things, but I'm not sure how to frame the question right. Or I'm not necessarily sure in my day-to-day professional life how many times I need a breakthrough insight. Like, I'm sure I could benefit from breakthrough insights all the time, but it seems like it's more rare than it is normal for me to be focusing on a kind of problem that lends itself to this. Like, oftentimes my problems that that like the presenting problems are just like, oh, I'm so busy, I have a lot of meetings, or, oh, I want to do my book launch and I want it to go well, or something like that. But it's not necessarily a problem, I think, that a breakthrough idea could solve, but maybe it could. I don't know. Like, how do you know what kinds of problems this is good for, or can we be applying it much more broadly than we might think of?
we can be applying it much more broadly, and this is where we run into that problem of it being emergent, right? And I know you very well, Dorie, and I know that you're like, I got my schedule, I got everything lined up, I got my calendar, everything's working. And so this idea of this process that's very sort of like, so it's a pinch of this, it's a dash of that, stir it up, put it in a bottle, wait and see what happens. Can be very frustrating for a lot of people. But the reality is that it's kind of a rolling process. And so it's a bit of a practice in that way for people. And so part of the idea is that if we pull back just a little bit, if we create a little bit of space in our lives from the constant hectic busyness, both to allow ourselves to take in different information and to allow ourselves to slow down for this part of our brains to work, it can open up possibilities in all kinds of different ways. Some of them can be personal. Some of them can be just about your relationship, about how you've been in your relationship. They can be about partnerships, business partnerships. They can be about your own schedule. Do you want your schedule to be like this? Do you not? Are there certain things you shouldn't really be focusing on or should be? So that's one way that the breakthroughs can come in and help in a way that we might not think, because we're just thinking, oh, they're here to solve a very specific problem. Another element to them is that if you're looking at your work and you're like, you want to do your work better, but you don't really know, like, well, how am I supposed to do that? Well, what am I supposed to do with that? One of the things that can be really interesting in terms of the breakthrough process is to start reading up on the history. This is a big part of your brain that engages in this network. So you start reading up on the history of people who've done the things that you've done. And I know that, Dorie, you interview a lot of people in this line of work, and I have no doubt that in gathering all that information, it's probably had an effect on the way that you view the work that you do. And there's an element to gathering that information, and you're lucky because it's a part of your job. But there's an element where gathering that information creates a library in your brain for your brain itself to take books out of and look at and get a sense like, oh, what if I did it in the way that I read about that guy in the 1920s doing it? We very often tend to think that because we have technology today, that there's nothing from the past that has anything to do with the issues we deal with today. But very often you find that people are dealing with very similar things and finding very similar solutions. And this is part of what we talk about in the book called associative thinking, where if you're able to associate between your situation and another situation, you actually find that there are breakthroughs you don't really have to work very hard on. Like the breakthrough sitting right there in front of you, and it opens up. So for people who are like, well, I don't really have a specific problem, so I don't really need a breakthrough, my answer in many ways is that mindset is actually part of the limiting factor that's holding you back from having bigger breakthroughs, because we can always shift the way we do things. We can always be doing things better. We can always be doing more. We can always be acting more true to ourselves. The question is, how open are we to that process? How open are we to engaging in that? And if there's a part of you that's like, well, I don't do that, or I don't need that, my answer would be, well, of course, read the book, but also to ask yourself why there's that closed space, because you're actually not allowing yourself to access this huge part of your own brain that can bring solutions you didn't even know you were looking for.
Yeah, really interesting. That's great. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about, Judah, there's a quote in the book that I thought was particularly interesting for people who are interested both in innovation and productivity. It said, minimalism is great for productivity, but not for creativity. Can you explain what you mean by this and how it might play out in our lives?
Okay, so from the and it's nice to give very pithy quotes. So when we say minimalism, what we mean is just streamlined, right? Lean Six Sigma, highly efficient, nothing is left that's extra. So we can just move the thing through, whatever it is, whatever the process is, we can just move it through. And that is excellent for productivity. And the problem is that we live in a world where we're not just being asked to be productive. So many of us are being asked to be creative at this point. So many of us are being asked to be innovative. And so creativity actually suffers when you take too much away, because we don't know which elements are going to help us be creative. We don't know which random fact is actually going to ping our breakthrough network and allow us to see the next great thing, the next way forward. We don't know what's actually going to be super helpful or not. What we do know is that it's the mixing and matching of different things that tends to lead to the creative opening. And so when you're too minimal, you just don't have access to enough diversity of facts, diversity of experience, diversity of memory, diversity of games, diversity of take your pick. And it's that diversity that then associates with one another, connects with one another to create novel approaches, create novel ideas, to create breakthroughs. So if you close your world too much, if you don't allow enough new information in, if you don't have enough new experiences, if you don't see enough new things, hear enough new things, it's very hard to really have a breakthrough of any kind, because you don't have the raw material necessary.
Yeah, interesting. That's great. So some other things that I thought were were very interesting in your book, and I'll hold it up one more time here. Your cool.
My niece was like, I really like the cover, but it should say butterfly in very small letters just along the wing. She's 7. I was like, thank you, my designer niece. Okay.
Yes, good suggestion there. So you talked in the book about pattern recognition and how that factors in with breakthrough thinking. What's the interplay there, Judah? What do we need to know?
So patterns are like shortcuts to the universe in many ways. They underlie things that appear to be very, very different, but in fact can be very, very similar. And so when you're able to practice pattern recognition, it very often, when you get good at it, it enables you to have much faster breakthroughs on what seems like something you might not know anything about. And you see this all the time in stories. We use an example in the book and where you write out the plot to the story Pocahontas, where John Smith comes and he meets this Indian princess and it's this paradise and there's a chief and there's a guy wedded to her, gets very angry about it. And then John Smith gets in trouble, but he actually wants to help take care of the people. And the Europeans have come to sort of take resources from the land, dum, 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 dum. And what's fascinating is you can actually take that written plot and then apply it to the movie Avatar. And it fits perfectly. You just change the names. You change the names of the characters, you change the name of the planet, and it's like, it's the same thing. And you realize, oh, it's literally the same story. Although at first when watching Avatar, you're so sort of dazzled and amazed by the special effects and everything else, you may not have realized that there was this pattern underlying it. And so if you'd understood the pattern, you would know exactly what was going to happen in Avatar. In a similar way, if you start to do this pattern recognition, you can figure out connections that other people may not. There's another example we use in the book of a hospital in Detroit, the Ford Hospital, West Bloomfield, was looking for a new CEO, and they hired a guy who used to run Ritz-Carlton hotels. And at first you're like, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. There doesn't seem to be any connection. But then you start to look at the pattern and you realize that, oh, these are businesses that are all about taking care of guests. They're all about seeing to guests having as restful and peaceful a time as they can. And they're about the human connection of service, whether it's a doctor or a concierge being of service to another. And what was fascinating is that when the new CEO came in, he made certain changes to the hospital, and the hospital ended up winning awards for these changes because they started treating patients like they were guests, and they had reservations, and they were able to get into their rooms really quickly. And they made it a part of the community around them with an organic cafeteria that people would come to for lunch. They'd come to the hospital for lunch, like, not because they had to be at the hospital, but because it was so good. People's windows would look out on this beautiful garden. It was all about the experience. And the health of the patients went up because it was such a more pleasant experience. They even put folding chairs in the patient rooms so that the doctors would sit down and be at eye level with the patients. And then the patient satisfaction went up. And these are all sort of like customer service orientations that were moved into a hospital that shifted the quality of care. And so from a pattern point of view, it's obvious. But if you don't have the pattern recognition, you're like, why would you hire a hotel guy into a hospital? So it enables that kind of breakthrough thinking to happen.
I love that. So how can you tune your meter to better perceive patterns? Because, a lot of people might know the story of Pocahontas and they might have seen Avatar, but they wouldn't put them together necessarily. How do we become more conscious of these things?
There are a couple of ways. One is just start reading up on patterns. You can start reading up on things like fractals or watching videos on YouTube about fractals and fractal geometry, and you start to see the patterns of fractal geometry everywhere in nature, and you start to see those patterns. Another one is you start to read about narratives and how there are certain stories that just repeat themselves over and over again. Joseph Campbell is a great person to look at for this kind of thing. And you start to see, oh, there are all these patterns to these stories. Another fun one is to start just noticing how songs sound very much alike. There's a hilarious YouTube clip of this. I think they're an Australian band, one of those comedic bands, and they have a 5-minute song that is like every 4/4 song you ever heard of. And so literally while playing the same exact tune, they sing about 25 different pop songs in a row. one after another. And what that does is it sort of opens your eyes to getting a sense of where the patterns are. And then you can go and start to be mindful and look for them. And so you're literally practicing doing it. And as you practice doing it, you get better at it because your brain starts to build the connections that allows you to start seeing these things.
Very nice. So, okay, last one here. I thought this was also really interesting. Would love for you to expound on it. The higher our level of neuroplasticity, the higher level of the higher chance of a creative breakthrough.
Yes.
What does that mean?
What the hell does that mean? So our brains, here's the big shift in our brains. You have to think of our brains as being structures, not exchange of chemicals. We're coming out of an age where we think of it as an age of chemicals, and we know about serotonin and we know about dopamine, and we imagine these chemicals moving back and forth, and that's how our brains work. And there's an element to that. But really what's going on in our brains, and this is sort of what neuroscience is really focusing on right now in many areas, is that our brains are built. They are literally neurons connecting to one another like Legos. But here's the thing. They're not static like Legos. You don't go searching through your big bag of Legos to find the right piece. Our neurons are constantly growing and then being pruned, and growing and being pruned. And some of us are really good or really well practiced at growing new neural connections. And some of us are not. The ability to grow new neural connections is what we mean when we say you're plastic. Now, if you want to have a breakthrough, that means you're going to think something brand new. Now, when you have a brand new thought, it's because you've created a brand new neural connection. That new physical structure actually represents that abstract thought you're having. So this is the part you have to get your head around, is that every time you have a thought, you're literally building a new neural connection in your brain. And it's no different than like being in shape or out of shape in your real life, right? So let's say you're completely out of shape, and then you try and do 10 push-ups and you get to 3 and you collapse. And you're like, well, I'm just weak. I guess that's that, right? You know that's not true. You know you just have to keep doing it and grow and get stronger. So the same thing is true of our plasticity. A lot of us, when we do the same things over and over again, because we're adults, we have busy lives, and we're asked to be very repetitive in our lives, what happens is we don't get a lot of practice building these new neural connections. So we're out of shape. Our brains, we're neurally out of shape. And so what we have to do is no different than like working out to build up our strength. We have to practice being plastic in order to build up the muscle to then have new thoughts. So sometimes we have a really hard time having breakthroughs simply because our brains aren't very good at building new connections. It has nothing to do with intelligence. We think it has to do with intelligence, or we think some people are just gifted. But there's actually this incredibly physical component to it, and you can just work out. You can do neural workouts. I want to be very clear here. All the research shows that brain gyms that you can join, quote unquote brain gyms, have no effect. So there's been no research to show that there's good effect to them. So that being said, this is where we come back to, so how do you build the plasticity? The answer is keep staying curious, keep looking at the new things, keep bringing new things into your world. Because every time you see something you've never seen before, every time you read something you've never read before, every time you hear something or eat something, anything brand new, it forces your brain to build a brand new connection. And the better you get at doing that, the more easily you'll have the ability to build a new connection that is a breakthrough thought.
That is an amazing note to end on. Judah, we've covered a lot of ground in this discussion of your new book, The Net and the Butterfly. Is there anything else that you want to make sure that we mention, and or perhaps you can tell people who want to learn more about you and about the book how they can best do that?
Sounds good. The one thing I want to mention is that everybody's capable of this. We live in a world where there's this mythology that there are special people who have the ability to have great breakthroughs. And everything adds to this, right? There's one Steve Jobs, there's one Elon Musk. And what you come to find out is even when you talk to these people, they'll tell you that, oh yeah, there were tons of people involved in it, because it's all about the information flow and the synthesizing. So don't count yourself out. Don't be like, well, that's not me. Well, I don't do that. It's not true, and it's unfair to yourself, and it's also unfair to the world. Because with everything going on in the world right now, we kind of need everybody starting to think about how to make things better. And we need everybody's input. And you have the capacity in your brain. If you're feeling like some of this is not really your style, it's probably just because you're out of practice. And so just know that, and know that everybody can get more plastic. Everybody can make these associations. Everybody can have a breakthrough. We all literally have the same engine in our brains. We have the same networks. It's just a question of how powerfully they're connected to one another or not. In terms of learning more about it, we have a website, net.butterfly.com, where you can go check out the book. The book is also on Amazon. You can check me out and just type my name into YouTube, and just lots of fun little videos come up, which I'm happy for you all to watch. They're on many different topics, sort of covering the span of sort of what we talked about in the beginning, all the random experiences I've had and the different things I've had to talk about. But even more than checking me out, I would say, like, just if there's one thing anybody takes from this, it's get curious. Just get curious. I don't really care what it's about, but just start bringing new things into your world, and you'll be amazed what happens just in your brain.
That's terrific. Judah Pollack, thank you very much. Great talking with you.
Thank you, Dorie. This was awesome. Appreciate it.